Working on all these lengthy projects like the book and like the Led Zeppelin re-releases with all this extra...
When people talk about the defining sound of Led Zeppelin, the conversation inevitably circles back to Jimmy Page. He wasn't just the guitarist, he was the architect, the producer, and the one who stitched together chaos into something monumental. Among the countless tracks that the band recorded, there was one in particular that Page singled out as being perfect. A song where, in his own words, it sounded bloody marvelous. And understanding why he felt that way requires digging into both the technical brilliance and the sheer force of chemistry that surrounded its creation.
The song in question was When the Levee Breaks, the thunderous closer of Led Zeppelin 4. For Page, this wasn't just another track. It was a moment where everything clicked. The atmosphere, the groove, the sound design, and the unrelenting power of John Bonham's drumming. It wasn't a typical Zeppelin jam cobbled together in a haze of experimentation. This was precision, mood, and raw energy aligning in a way that even Page admitted could never be recreated again. The origins of When the Levee Breaks went back decades before Zeppelin even existed. It was originally a blues song, recorded by Kansas Joe McCoy and Memphis Minnie in 1929, inspired by the catastrophic Mississippi flood of 1927. But like much of Zeppelin's work, Page and the band took the foundation and transformed it into something that barely resembled the source. By the time it appeared on Led Zeppelin 4, it was no longer a Delta blues track. It was an apocalyptic wall of sound.
What made the recording stand out wasn't just the riffs or the harmonica or Plant's ghostly vocals. It was the drums. John Bonham's opening beat became legendary, not just because of the rhythm, but because of how it was recorded. Page, with his meticulous ear, placed Bonham at the bottom of a staircase in the Grand Hall of Headley Grange, a rundown mansion the band used as a recording space. With microphones hanging from the staircase, Page captured a sound that was massive, cavernous, and completely unlike anything anyone had ever heard before.
This wasn't studio trickery in the modern sense.
It was innovation born out of necessity. Zeppelin didn't have the most polished, high-tech studio at Headley Grange, but they had Page's vision, and they had Bonham's sheer force. The result was a drum sound that practically shook the walls. For Page, hearing it back in the control room was a revelation. He described it later as the moment where the song went from an idea to something otherworldly. The rest of the band built around that foundation. John Paul Jones added a bass line that locked perfectly with Bonham's groove, making the track feel heavy without ever dragging. Robert Plant reworked the lyrics, taking inspiration from the original 1929 recording, but delivering them with a haunted wail that made the whole track sound like a warning from the past. And Page himself layered guitars, harmonica, and effects until the song felt like a sonic storm. What stood out most to Page was the atmosphere. Unlike tracks that leaned on flashy solos or tight structures, When the Levee Breaks was sprawling. It didn't follow conventional rock patterns. It looped, it churned, it pulled the listener into a trance-like state. For Page, this wasn't just music, it was mood, captured perfectly. He once said it was one of the few Zeppelin tracks where he felt everything aligned in such a way that he couldn't imagine improving. And yet the band quickly discovered that this perfection was fragile. When they tried to play the song live, it never worked. The sound that had been captured in the stairwell of Headley Grange was impossible to reproduce on stage. The tempo, the echoes, the heaviness, they were artifacts of that one recording. Even with Bonham's unmatched power, the live versions lacked the otherworldly depth of the studio track. For Page, that only reinforced its uniqueness. The song existed in its purest form only on the record, frozen in time, untouchable.
This sense of perfection carried weight because Page was not someone who used that word lightly. He was a relentless perfectionist, often spending hours tweaking mixes, re-recording parts, and obsessing over details that most listeners would never notice. For him to declare a song perfect meant that it had achieved something beyond technical mastery. It had captured an emotion, a presence, an energy that couldn't be manufactured. When the Levee Breaks also stood out in Zeppelin's catalog because of its cultural resonance. At its core, the song was about disaster, displacement, and the unstoppable force of nature. By reimagining it in 1971, Zeppelin tapped into a timeless anxiety. The track sounded like the end of the world, a sonic flood that swept everything in its path. It wasn't just heavy, it was ominous. And in the early 1970s, with the world facing political turmoil, economic uncertainty, and cultural upheaval, that sense of looming catastrophe struck a chord.
For Bonham, the track was a showcase of his power. For Plant, it was a chance to stretch his voice in ways that felt eerie and prophetic. For Jones, it was another opportunity to prove that his bass lines were the glue holding everything together. But for Page, it was more personal. He had spent years chasing sounds in studios, trying to get the right balance of rawness and polish. On this track, he felt he had found it. The sound wasn't clean, but it was alive. The fact that Page himself later singled it out as bloody marvelous is telling. Zeppelin had countless iconic songs, Stairway to Heaven, Whole Lotta Love, Kashmir, but Page's affection for When the Levee Breaks showed his priorities as a producer and musician. It wasn't about chart success or radio play. It was about the art of capturing lightning in a bottle, of creating something that felt elemental. Interestingly, the song's legacy has only grown with time, largely because of its drums. The opening beat became one of the most sampled in music history. Hip-hop producers in the 1980s and 1990s gravitated toward it, using it in countless tracks, from the Beastie Boys to Dr. Dre. The influence of When the Levee Breaks stretched far beyond rock. The fact that Page's perfect track ended up shaping entire genres decades later only reinforced its timelessness. But within Zeppelin's own history, it stood as a rare case where the band collectively acknowledged they couldn't top what they had done. Many of their songs evolved on stage, becoming longer, heavier, or more improvisational. When the Levee Breaks didn't. It was locked in place, a monument. And for Page, that was exactly why it was perfect.